Y enseguida vamos al mensaje final, la pandemia que viene. Nos va a presentar y tenemos el honor de contar con la presencia del doctor Peter Palese. Él es profesor de microbiología en la Escuela de Medicina del Monte Sinaí. Es microbiólogo y virólogo, especialista en virus RNA, particularmente la influenza. Desarrolló vacunas universales contra la influenza, pionero en genética inversa para el virus RNA, es galardonado por el premio Robert Koch y premio Sanofi Institut Pasteur. Es miembro de las Academias Nacionales de Ciencia y Medicina de Estados Unidos. Es realmente un honor contar con usted, doctor.
Okay, let me first congratulate Bernardo Lozano for having built a wonderful vaccine company here in Mexico. Really, congratulations. Where are you, Bernardo? Okay, here. Really great job. And you built it on science, and you also relied on evidence-based medicine. So that's really fantastic, and I really want to congratulate you. I also want to thank our organizer, Constantino Lopez, who brought the Academy here with all the guests, and I think it's a wonderful symposium, and both congratulations, wonderful. The final message is the coming pandemic, and the bottom line is it will come, but no one knows when, okay? So this is the final message. I guess you got it in Spanish as well. And we have here eclectically some plagues, some pandemic diseases, and they can be caused by viruses or by bacteria. And plague is caused by Yersinia pestis, which is a lousy bacterium. And the one I have listed here is the plague of the 16th century. And we heard already in the morning about this. Also, it's called Justinian plague because the Emperor Justin of Constantinople actually had to suffer under this pandemic. And also in Europe in the 14th century, 1347, we had again a plague, and this we refer to frequently as Black Death. And that one is also caused by a very similar bacterium which we have now, because it was possible from root canals to actually extract the bacterium in enough sequences so one could compare the bacterium from the 14th century with the bacterium which is circulating now, or which can be found now, and this is something quite interesting. There is also a third plague which is referred to in history, and that's the Antonine plague. And that is a funny one, and Antonine plague, it's called because of Antoninus. It's the second name of Mark Aurelius, who was the Roman emperor around 190 AD. And that was actually called a plague, but it is not a plague. It's most likely a pandemic which was caused by pox viruses. So for a local interest, there is also a very dramatic experience in the 15th century, 16th century, actually 1545, and that is called Cocolistli, which is caused by salmonella, and is not really a pandemic, because with pandemic we think it should be more worldwide, and it has not really been broader than Mexico and this area of the Americas. It hasn't gone into other areas. And so this brings us then right away to the definition of a plague, of a pandemic, and that is, it is difficult to really have one definition which is working on everything. There's something a little bit strange. The pandemic, which is in the very small font here, is COVID-19, and that was called a pandemic in, I think, March of 2020, and then it was called off by WHO again 3 years later. So this is something which, like the influenza virus pandemics, which were real pandemics going around the country, around the globe, was not the flu pandemic events and the COVID-19. They were really globally all over the country, the world, whereas, for example, there should be 3 diseases listed here. For example, the tuberculosis, which is not really a global pandemic. It's also HIV would be in a definition of a global, and then there are other diseases really which have dramatic impacts, but they are not fitting one scheme, so to speak. Now, if we go back to influenza viruses, then as I mentioned, we have several pandemics with influenza A and B viruses. On the top, we have the influenza A viruses, and the red and the filled squares define when we had pandemics. The first one, influenza pandemics, the first one was in 1918, 1919, then 1957, H2, and 1968, H3, and then we had a recurrence of 1977 of H1, and then finally a pandemic in 2009, which, as you all know, the early isolates come from Mexico and from Canada, from California. So this is quite important. Also, what is important is that we had almost H1 for the entire period starting from 1918 until 2025, except for a 20-year hiatus between 1968 and then 77. There was no H1N1 viruses, but after that we still have H1N1 viruses. And there is also another hiatus, and that was 2020 to 2022. You can see that in here in the H3, in the pandemic one, and also in terms of the influenza B viruses, we had a hiatus of 2 years. And we will talk a little bit more about it. And something else is quite important, that the there were 2 lineages of influenza B viruses. One is Victoria, the other one is the Yamagata. The Yamagata was for 40 years and then actually disappeared in 2020, and unfortunately we don't know why it disappeared. Right now we have only one influenza B virus lineage, and the vaccine only contains the 3 lineages. One is the pandemic H1 up here, the H3, and then we have the 1 Victoria lineage of the influenza B viruses. And so we really don't understand why we have pandemic viruses pop up. We had 11 years with H2N2. We had long periods of H1. So it's really quite difficult. And I think we have heard it's difficult to make predictions. I think Arturo was mentioned this to us in the morning. And I think this is really true. We really, even though we know quite a lot about influenza viruses, we still don't understand why we have one period of 11 years, then H3 much longer, H1 even longer, some Yamagata lines dying out. This is really something very difficult to understand. Now, the 1918 is sort of the, in the newer history, really a very well described and very well documented pandemic, and the estimates are that between 50 and 100 million people died. As a matter of fact, if we multiply this by 4, at that time there were 2 billion per population in the world. We have now about 8, so that would translate into 20 to 400 million deaths, and that's quite dramatic. Adolfo Garcia Sastre and myself, in collaboration with Terry Tampi, we were able to reconstruct this 1918-1919 virus, and we published this in Science exactly 20 years ago, and this was quite a difficult enterprise. First, we had to negotiate the NIH, the CDC, etc., but also technically it wasn't that easy. Nevertheless, we got the virus out, which was isolated by Terry Tampi at the CDC under a BSL biosafety level 4 conditions, and we pretty soon found out that antibodies work against this virus, so it is not immune suppressive. We found out quite soon that antivirals against flu would work, and also that we are facing descendants of this 1918 virus, so that we have some partial immunity, at least if such a virus would pop up again. So what is this virus? The 1918-1919 virus is here in all its beauty, and we can see an electron micrograph here with the 8 RNAs on the inside, and there is 7 around and 1 in the middle, and then we have a lipid membrane, and what is important, what the immune system sees is sort of the outside of the virus, and the outside consists of hemagglutinins and neuraminidase, and there's actually a total of 19 different hemagglutinins, and that's important because the major determinant whether or not there is a pandemic has to do with the hemagglutinins. Now, the next slide says that there are 19 different hemagglutinins subtypes. As we will see, we have only 3 subtypes, H1, H2, and H3 in humans, and we again don't really know why we only have seen, at least in the last 100 years, H1, H2, and H3. And what we can do, however, is we can compare the different hemagglutinins subtypes, and this is a comparison of the different hemagglutinins. This is done by Florian Kramer, and one can see here 2 different groups, group 2 and group 1 here, and this here, the length of this bar here is 7% difference. So if you want to know how related or how different are, for example, an H1 and an H2 virus here, you take this bar of 7% and go 7%, 14%, 21%, so you get about 28, 30% differences from an H1 to an H2. And we have, so far, we have only had the 3 H1, H2, and H3 in humans, and occasionally, but very, very occasionally, we have H7, for example, some cases H5, but nothing to write home about. So this is something which is difficult to understand. Why only H1, H2, and H3, even though some of these viruses, these other hemagglutinins subtypes have shown up. Now, in terms of these other ones, one can find them in birds quite frequently, but not in humans. And then the question is really, okay, let me try if I can get this moving. Can someone help me? Okay, so there is quite some interest in particularly H5 viruses, and the reason for that is that it was recently found that this virus is with wild birds in millions, if not in billions. Also in poultry, and this is for the United States, 49 states have been affected with outbreaks. Dairy herds have been also affected in most states. I think the last one is 17 states have been affected. And then many mammalian species have been found to be infected by these H5N1 viruses. And there the numbers are, I think that one of the latest one was 46 different mammalian species. So you can see that one is concerned that these viruses of the H5N1 subtype can jump. On the other hand, let me suggest that in 1959, there was the first H5N1 virus detected in poultry, and that one was actually quite virulent, and I have worked several decades ago for a whole year on this H5N1 virus from Scotland, and I have sky-high antibody titers because every week I was isolating the virus from about 100 infected eggs. And I don't remember having ever been sick, and but I have wonderful antibodies. So I'm saying this, that it is difficult to predict what will happen. Are these viruses really now mammalian adapted? Are bald eagles dying, which is a big thing in the United States, and are we next? And also one has to be aware of the fact that one should try not to do experiments which are falling under the rubric of gain-of-function experiments. And there was a big discussion about 10 years ago that experiments were done where H5 viruses were passaged in ferrets and they were made more transmissible. And so those are experiments which I think one should be carefully thinking about it. On the other hand, how else would we find out what the properties are? I think the answer is if we really do this under the right biosafety conditions. So we are all aware of the varying vaccine efficacy, and from year to year it ranges from 10 to 60%. And so one of the questions is, how can we do better than the present vaccines, which have this varying efficacy, as I mentioned? And this is just very briefly, we have developed, and that is again Florian Kramer's group, Adolfo Garcia-Sauster's group, and my own. We have tried to make a universal influenza virus vaccine, which is based on the fact that the hemagglutinin that's on the outside of the virus, which I showed before, has two large domains. One is a stalk, and the other one is the tip. And it turns out that the stalk is much more conserved than the tip, which is varying. And so what we have tried is, we have tried to make viruses, vaccine strains, vaccine constructs, which force our immune system towards the stalk-specific domain, and we have exchanged the head with exotic hemagglutinins from other viruses, other influenza viruses, which we have not seen. And by giving this consecutive way, the different influenza viruses which have a conserved stem but have irrelevant heads, one can actually induce in animals, but also in clinical trials we have shown that one can get a better immune response against these stalks. So that's what we are trying to do to sort of hopefully have vaccines which are effective against most influenza viruses, if not all, by using a technology to direct the immune system towards these conserved stalks of the virus, hemagglutinin. Now, when we talk about the pandemic strains, I already mentioned that the second one where we really had a very good pandemic, and I don't want to call it a good pandemic experience, an extensive pandemic experience where we have seen tremendous interest. And for example, we have, if one looks at PubMed and just looks at the entries, these are the individual papers, HIV is still sort of the winner with 436,000 entries. But then already we have coronaviruses, which have 285,000 entries, followed by influenza, much less. And when I started out, herpes was the number one, really, and now it's number 4 in if we look at HIV, coronavirus, and influenza. But you can see the tremendous interest in these two pandemic viruses, coronaviruses, influenza, and obviously we are still fighting HIV, unfortunately. So very briefly, we all have seen most likely this New York Times whole page, which came out in 22, May of 22, and that shows the map of the United States. Each one of these dots is a single person who died of COVID-19 rather than with COVID-19, and you can see that this took a tremendous toll on everything in terms of personal life, obviously government, etc. And this map shows when we crossed the 1 million deaths in the United States. And I think this is something which is really quite impressive and really, I think, makes us understand that this was and is a real problem. Now, if we look at the same map again of a dendrogram where we compare the different hemagglutinins of influenza viruses with the different spike proteins of the coronaviruses in terms of variation, we should look again at the 7% bar here. And I showed before that if you go along these lines, you add up to 7%, you can find 28, 30% for H1, H2. And we have a similar one. Again, this is from Florian Kramer. We have not 19 subtypes, but we have 5 subtypes in terms of coronaviruses, four, alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And we can see that there are as many variants possible, so to speak, in terms of coronaviruses, and we have only really experienced one at this point. So this is something we should be understanding and we should be worried about. And whether the SARS coronaviruses are varying more or less is still, I think, a debate. This shows here, we have seen this already, where this is 100%, and this shows the different prevalence of the different variants. And the question really is, are SARS coronaviruses varying more than, less than, or about the same as influenza virus? And it depends a little bit how you define variation, but I think the jury is still out on whether they are similar or not. But I feel that if we're lucky, SARS coronavirus 2 will be like influenza viruses. But again, nothing is. It's always difficult to make predictions about the future. Now, in terms of the so I want to sort of oh God, I think you got a different version of here. So we have a continuing monitoring of 4 different respiratory viruses, and these are data which come from mostly Viviana Simon's laboratory, and it shows the peaks of the influenza A viruses. And we have here now also the RSV. And what you can see is that RSV is usually to the left of the influenza A virus peak. And if you look carefully, you can see that the influenza B viruses are to the right. And that also, we really don't understand why RSV has its peak a couple of weeks before the influenza A virus peak as compared to the RSV, which has it before. So these are things, despite all the knowledge, it's very difficult to understand, and one can really only hope that we will have enough good surveillance, and that it is the future will be, and we have good vaccines, and so that we will be protected. And so I want to say, however, that you have heard it already, we have a question, not when is the next, or if the next pandemic is appearing, and whether it's a coronavirus, an influenza virus, or yet another one, is pretty clear, but we don't know when this will take place. And also, we have to think of what Joshua Lederberg, I think he was the youngest Nobel Prize winner in physics, said, we have only our wits against their genes. The viruses and bacteria are unfortunately quite adept, avoiding us, or not avoiding us, evading us, and causing us a lot of problems. And again, the bottom line, I think, is pandemics will continue, and we better protect us against them. Thank you very much.